All right, are you ready? It is that time. It is time for my annual winter forecast video. Now, if you have stumbled across this video and you want a short, to the point forecast, not a lot of detail, not a lot of meteorology, then I would suggest you head to wfmj.com/weather and check out my short kind of newscast version of the annual winter forecast. This video is going to be long, it's going to be detailed, and it's geared towards not only weather geeks, but also those who just need a lot of detail in their winter forecast. If your business is dependent on winter weather, if you run a snowplow operation and things like that, this is the kind of video that may appeal to you. So let's not waste any time. Let's get right to it. In this forecast video, we're going to talk about temperatures during the months of meteorological winter, December, January, and February. The snow forecast ideas are basically first flake to last flake. And in Northeast Ohio, Northwest PA, that oftentimes is right around November to sometime in late March or April when we see those last flakes of the season. So that's kind of what you can expect as far as the time of the year that we're talking about here. And in our part of the country, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, of course, you can see winter trying to linger into March and, well, sometimes April. But when it comes to temperatures, we focus on the core months of winter, December through February. And of course, if we're going to have a cold winter this year, we're going to have to break a long streak of pretty warm winters, culminating in two of the warmest winters on record for the Youngstown area in the last two, 2022 into 2023, and last year was even warmer, 2023 into 2024, almost 7 degrees warmer than the average. We haven't had a legit cold, harsh winter in about a decade across our part of the country. It was the winter of 2014-2015. The year after that, we had a super El Nino that formed in the Pacific, and no surprise with a super El Nino, we had a warm winter in 2015-2016, but ever since then, we've been hard-pressed to have a lot of sustained cold in our winter seasons. Now, the closest we've come to a pretty typical winter was the winter of 2017-2018, when it was actually right at or even just a shade below the average, but that's just splitting hairs a little bit. For all intents and purposes, that was a pretty normal winter. We've been warmer than the average most of our winters, of course, over the last decade. And in the calendar year 2024 specifically, it's been, of course, very warm. We had a very warm winter. We had a warm spring, warm summer. Fall so far has been warm, and so it's no surprise both the state of Ohio and the state of Pennsylvania have had their warmest years on record through the end of October. And so far in November, we really haven't seen much of a pattern change. It's been warmer than the average more often than not here in the month of November. So the numbers last year for the winter season at the Youngstown Warren Regional Airport, which is in Trumbull County, a little ways north of downtown Youngstown, a little bit closer to the secondary snow belt, that specific location averages about 67 inches worth of snow per season. And the number last year finished at 37.4. Now that is 30 inches below the average, but it's more than we had the previous winter. The previous winter, we had like 22 inches worth of snow at the airport. So in our television viewing area, this airport location can be quite a bit snowier than some other parts of the area. In, say, southern Columbiana County, closer to East Liverpool, snowfall totals last year, no more than 10 inches, 12 inches in a lot of places. And so it was a pretty snow-free winter for the second consecutive winter. When it comes to our temperatures last winter, we only had about 10 days of true winter, and that was right in the heart of January. Climatologically speaking, the coldest time of the year, and appropriately enough, last winter, that was our coldest stretch, but that's the only stretch of colder than average temperatures that we had last winter. December, we almost ran the table with warmth. February, we almost ran the table with warmth with just a couple of colder than average days. Again, it was just this stretch in mid-January that was legit cold during the heart of last winter. Some other numbers from the winter of 2023-2024. Overall, in December, it was the second warmest December on record with only about 4 inches or so worth of snow. And the trend, again, continued right into January and February. We had that cold stretch in mid-January, but then February was the fifth warmest on record. And when you look at December through February last winter, it was the second warmest winter on record overall, only trailing 1931 into 1932. We have pretty good temperature records going back to about the early 30s in our area. Some spotty records going back to the late 1800s, but we have consistent temperature records dating back to the early 1930s. We were not alone in the lack of snow last year. All the oranges and yellows that you see on this map, that's below average snowfall last winter, and basically the entire state of Ohio, almost the entire state of Pennsylvania, with the exception of some of the highest peaks along the spine of the Appalachians, had below average snowfall totals. Some of the mountainous areas in New England, the Green and White Mountains, the Adirondacks, the Catskills, they did a little bit better in the snow department last year, but everywhere else pretty much around the Great Lakes and Northeast, it was a pretty paltry winter in the snow department. Now, when you consider how remarkable last winter was, and the winter before that as well, it's no surprise that our winter forecast did not do very well last winter, because we would have to be super bold to go out with a forecast saying, hey, we're going to have the second or third warmest winter on record. We're going to have way less snow than average. That's a pretty bold forecast, and not only did I not make that forecast last winter, just about every other reputable source did not have the kind of winter forecast that ended up coming to fruition last winter. So our grades, we said it would be colder than 2022, 2023. That was not the right idea. In fact, it was a little bit warmer than the previous winter. We called for below average snow, and while that certainly was right, we didn't capture the magnitude of, or how far below the average it was. It turned out to be. And temperature-wise, of course, we did not have a cold winter forecast last year. We thought it would be warmer than the average, just not nearly as far above the average as it ended up being. All right, so let's start looking forward into this upcoming winter season. What are we looking at? What are the big factors? In the Pacific Ocean, we have a weak, pretty weak La Nina. We're going to talk about La Nina more. We also have a strongly negative, what's called the PDO, or Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We're also going to talk about that. Those are the two most important things, I think, when it comes to our upcoming winter season. Also a factor this season, the sun, very, very busy. What we mean by that, a lot of sunspots. We've had the northern lights very visible at times here in 2024, indicating a very busy sun with a lot of geomagnetic storms and a lot of activity. The sun goes in 11-year cycles. It's quiet, then it's busy. It's quiet, then it's busy. And we're almost right at the peak, we think, of the current solar cycle. In other words, the solar maximum is upon us, or just about to be upon us. Well, when you factor that in, or combine that with the positive phase of what's known as the quasi-biennial oscillation, that's basically a measure of a belt of winds way up in the stratosphere, almost up into outer space, at the very top of the atmosphere. Those winds at that level change directions roughly about every year and a half. And that can have an impact on the polar vortex and what that does in the northern hemisphere during the winter season. We won't get too far into the meteorology on that, because that's getting pretty far down into the weeds. But when you factor in the positive phase of that QBO, that belt of winds way up in the stratosphere, when you combine that with a solar maximum, that tends to increase the strength of the polar vortex, which actually keeps it locked in more often up over the North Pole. A weak polar vortex is one that likes to meander a little bit more. A meandering polar vortex can allow more cold air outbreaks in lower latitudes, such as Ohio and Pennsylvania. Other things we're not going to talk about in a lot of detail, but they are big factors. A positive AMO, which basically means the Atlantic Ocean is very, very warm. Wild cards for the upcoming winter season. Just like every other winter season, the polar vortex is a wild card. Forecasting its amplitude, its meandering nature is hard to do on a seasonal scale, but we can say, when I was referring to that QBO and the solar maximum, that it's less likely that the polar vortex is going to do a lot of meandering around. But occasionally it may still meander, and that's kind of hard to predict more than a few weeks at a time. MJO refers to thunderstorms over the tropics of the Pacific all the way back into the Indian Ocean. Those outbreaks of thunderstorms and convection can actually impact the configuration of the jet stream over the Pacific, and therefore it can impact the jet stream over North America. All these things are interrelated and complicated, and I could spend a couple of hours talking about some of these subjects. We won't get into a lot of detail, I should say, on a lot of those subjects. But just know they are a factor. They are things that we are looking at. And again, La Nina is going to be a factor this winter, but I don't think it's going to be a super big factor, because La Nina is pretty darn weak. this time around. When we look back at our La Nina years and our El Nino years over the last, say, 20 years, last year we had a strong El Nino during the winter season. Well, this year we've gone into La Nina territory, but just barely, and I don't think we're going to have a strong La Nina this winter like 2010, 2011, like 2007, 2008, 99 into 2000, also a strong La Nina. I don't think we're going to see that during this winter season. But we are looking pretty strongly at areas outside of that La Nina zone. When we look at ocean water temperatures compared to average over the Pacific, here's La Nina right here. It's this belt of cooler than average waters in equatorial areas. I think a bigger factor this winter is actually this up here, this configuration. Very, very warm water. A true marine heat wave coming off of Asia into the northern parts of the Pacific Ocean, combined with this cooler water in the Gulf of Alaska. This is that PDO thing I was talking about. This is the strongly negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This is something we've had for a few years now. It's really been strong, and it's at its strongest probably as we speak. And I think this correlates pretty strongly with these remarkably warm winters we've had over the last couple of years. El Nino or La Nina, it hasn't mattered that much when you have this going on in the northern Pacific Ocean, and I think we are going to have this going on once again during the upcoming winter. But before we leave this issue of the La Nina versus El Nino, to get an extreme winter around here on either end, typically we have something going on, either El Nino or La Nina. And if you want a really cold winter, a top 10 cold winter, you typically want a weak El Nino. You don't want a strong El Nino, but you want an El Nino that's weak. The warm side of the ledger here, there tends to be more variety in our top 10 warmest winters, including the last couple, going back to 1950 anyway. We have a weak La Nina on here. That was a couple years ago. We have a strong El Nino on here. We have a few strong El Ninos, I should say, including last winter, the warm winters of 1982 into 83, 97 into 98, 15 into 16, all those strong El Ninos. You have a moderate La Nina on here. You have a couple of neutral years. But as you can see, there's a little more variety on that side of the chart. Our really cold winters tend to be weak El Ninos. A weak La Nina, it can go either way, but again, that Pacific Decadal Oscillation, I think, is an important factor. So we make these winter forecasts. One of the things we do when we make a seasonal forecast is look at analogs, past years that we think closely resemble what's going on in the oceans, in the atmosphere, this fall heading into this winter. Here's my list of top analogs. Now, there are some cold and snowy winters on this list, including 2008, 2009, especially 2010 into 2011. By many measures, that was our harshest winter on record. Not in the 1970s. 2010 into 2011, we had 115-ish inches worth of snow at the Youngstown Warren Airport that winter. Temperatures almost 5 degrees colder than the average. That was a doozy of a winter. But those are the exceptions on this list. A lot of pretty warm winters on this list, including 2022 into 2023. 99 into 2000 is on the list, even towards the top, even though that was a pretty strong La Nina. We're not going to have a La Nina that rivals that in terms of its magnitude, but there's a lot of similarities otherwise to 99, 2000, aside from the strength of La Nina, which is different. Another one on this list, 2016, 2017. Bears a lot of similarities, we think, to this fall into this upcoming winter. So when you average all those analogs together, you get something that looks like this. Snowfall totals, about 16 inches and change below average. Temperatures between 1 and 2 degrees above the average. But that's averaging together all those years. As you can see, there are years in which the numbers from average are pretty big. But when you when you run the math and average them all together, that's what you get. We also look forward. In addition to looking backwards, we look forward, and we use computer models, just like we do when we assemble the typical 5 and 7 day forecasts. We look at long-range computer models. Now, we have to take these with a grain of salt at these types of timescales. Just like we have to take some modeling with a grain of salt even 12 hours ahead of time when we're forecasting where a line of thunderstorms is going to be, or something like that. These seasonal models, some years they do pretty well. Some years they bust really, really badly. I will tell you that, well, I'm just going to show you one set of modeling here because we could be here all night talking about all the modeling that's out there. There's pretty good consensus amongst the computer models and a lot of maps that look like this. Cold weather compared to the average, most favored along the west coast of Canada, perhaps into the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., and warmer than average temperatures favored from the Rockies on east up into eastern Canada. This suite of modeling, this is called the National Multi-Model Ensemble, looks very similar to a lot of other kind of climate modeling for the upcoming winter season. So when we factor in the modeling, the analogs, gut feeling, let's break this down month by month first. As winter begins in December, I think this is the month that actually has a chance of producing a few stout instances of cold. 2 winters ago, 2022 into 2023, very exceptionally warm winter, but we had a harsh Arctic outbreak accompanied by wind right at Christmas time that winter. Those kinds of outbreaks can still happen in a very warm winter. And I wouldn't be shocked if we had, 1 or 2 pretty tough outbreaks of cold weather in the month of December. So the map overall shows warmer than average temperatures favored in December, and I'm pretty confident in that idea. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the month of December we had a couple of pretty stout cold snaps. Now, as we flip the calendar to 2025, I think either January or February is likely to be a real blowtorch, perhaps a historically warm month compared to the average. It could be January or it could be February. I'm putting my chips down on January, even though I wouldn't bet my life on it. Would it shock me if February is the month that is a true blowtorch? No, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I think one of the months has a chance to be that. And, my current thinking is it's probably January. When we look at our analog years, there's a lot of really warm Januaries on that list. And so that's something we'll be watching out for as we head into 2025. February, a lot of our analog years, the pattern becomes even more amplified over the U.S. And what I mean by that is we get big ridges and big troughs with a little more frequency in February, leading to perhaps a colder than average month along the West Coast, warmer than average temperatures favored once again in the East. At this point, I don't think that the month of February is likely to be as cold in terms of magnitude as January. But again, wouldn't shock me if February ends up being our blowtorch month as well. I think both months, January and February, are likely to be warmer than the average, though. So when we stitch that all together and talk about December, January, and February, this is what the map looks like. Again, the Pacific Northwest, the area most likely to have a colder than average winter overall. Rockies on east, warmer than average winter is favored this time around. So let's put some numbers on this, some percentages, because weather forecasts, especially seasonal forecasts, probability is the way to go when it comes to a lot of these things. Because can we say with 100% certainty it's going to be a really warm winter, or a really cold winter, or a really snowy winter, or anything like that? No, we can't do that. The science is not there. It's not going to be there in my lifetime. So we put some percentages on these things. We think at this point there's about an 80% chance that it's going to be a warmer than average winter, and only about a 10% chance of a colder than average winter. That doesn't close the door. It's a 1 in 10 chance. But it doesn't close the door on the atmosphere having different ideas and there being a little bit of a surprise. But our money is on this side of the ledger, certainly, with an 80% chance or a likelihood of a warmer than average winter. These are some of the most aggressive numbers I've ever put on this forecast graphic. I've been, kind of doing these percentages for a few winters in a row now. This is the most aggressive I've gotten with the numbers on the temperature side. When it comes to snow, this is a trickier forecast because even in a winter that doesn't feature much snow, you can have 1, maybe 2 really big storms that skew the numbers tremendously. And so, this gets a little bit tricky, but here's what we are thinking as far as a region-wide average. About a 55% chance of less snow than average, about a 1 in 5 or so chance that it's near average, and about a 20 to 25% chance that it's less snowy than the average. We can have a couple of snowstorms. We can also have 1 or 2 maybe Mondo Lake effect events that really skew the numbers. And so that's a tricky forecast. It's tricky business doing these snow forecasts, but we try it anyway. As far as our viewing area, this is a look at our 5-county television viewing area and what we think in terms of snowfall totals for the upcoming winter. We live in truly kind of the secondary snow belt of Northeast Ohio and Northwest PA. The prime snow belt just east of Cleveland, eastern Cuyahoga County, Lake Geauga, Ashtabula, up into Erie and Crawford counties in Pennsylvania, then up into western New York, up closer to Buffalo. That's kind of the prime snowbelt. We're more in a secondary snowbelt in our viewing area, especially around and north of Interstate 80. And so it's no surprise that we have a gradient here, both in terms of climatology and our forecast for this upcoming winter. Even in a warm winter, you could probably still see 50 inches or so worth of snow in a place like Bloomfield, Mesopotamia, Johnston, Greenville, New Lebanon, places like that. Whereas down towards East Liverpool, closer to the Ohio River, you might not see much more than 15 inches worth of snow once again this upcoming winter season. So this map looks like it looks the way it does because of the lake effect component. There are winter storms in which we have a gradient, a snowfall gradient, but those winter storms tend to average out or cancel each other out a little bit in terms of things on a seasonal scale, whereas the lake effect component definitely more often than not is more heavily weighted towards our northern viewing area. Another way to look at this winter compared to last winter. I realize that not everyone's a super weather geek and has a institutional knowledge of what the winter was like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, things like that. A lot of us remember last winter. So let's compare this winter to last winter. Last winter, we were in this quadrant right here. This is the drier side of this graphic, the snowier side, this is the colder side, and the warmer side. And so we were in the warm and dry quadrant last winter. I think we're going to be there again this winter. Now, I would not explicitly come out with a forecast that is as extreme as the last couple of winters. That would be extremely bold and a low percentage kind of a forecast. But as I just showed you, I think there are pretty good odds that we're somewhere in that quadrant, in that neighborhood of less snow than usual and warmer temperatures than usual. It's been pretty dry over the last several months, and so I've talked about the lack of snow this upcoming winter is seeming like that's the most likely outcome, is it's a less snowy than average winter season. Precipitation-wise in total, when you factor in all the rain, the sleet, the freezing rain, the snow, every type of precipitation over the winter season, it may end up being close to or perhaps even wetter than the average. And that would be good news because it's been pretty dry over the last several months. When you look at the soil moisture as of today, not only in Ohio and western PA, but in a lot of the Corn Belt, a lot of the Great Lakes, this has been a dry stretch. And, skipping beyond winter and heading into next spring, there are, analogs to the spring after a weak La Nina being pretty dry. And so, it's been dry. It may be dry next spring come planting time and as the growing season begins. And so some wet weather over the winter would definitely be welcome in the winter of 2024 into 2025. Even if the snow totals aren't up to snuff, if we get total precipitation that is within shouting distance of average, that would be helpful going into next spring. All right, that'll do it for me. I hope you enjoyed this long extended version of the 2024-2025 winter forecast. We'll be updating this forecast in about a month. We'll be reviewing this forecast in an honest way, as we always do at the end of the season, at the end of February and the start of March. I've been having to issue some pretty tough grades over the last couple of winters because, again, extreme winters have been the rule, and those are hard forecasts to get right when the atmosphere wants to be as extreme as it has been over the last couple of years, and that's why we went a little more aggressive with our numbers for this winter forecast. Make sure you're following me on all the social media outlets for short-term and long-term forecasts, and I do, long-form weather videos. We call them Weather for Weather Geeks. They're shorter than this video, but they're longer than your typical newscast video. They are posted every evening on YouTube and linked on my social media accounts. So if you're not a longtime follower of me and my content, make sure you're following me wherever you get your weather forecasts for the very latest. I'm a straight shooter. I hope you'll find that I always am, I'm not beating around the bush, and when the forecast goes awry, we tell you about it, whether it be a snowfall forecast for the next day or a seasonal forecast like this one. Have a great night, everyone, and thanks as always for watching this winter forecast video.